The fluorescent lights of Whole Foods in Manhattan hummed faintly overhead as Alexander Pierce pushed a half-empty cart down the produce aisle. He had come here without much thought, intending only to pick up a few items before retreating to his vast but hollow penthouse overlooking Central Park. The billionaire had grown accustomed to moving through the world like a ghost these past months. 7 months to be exact. 7 months since the divorce papers were signed. 7 months since he had last seen her. 7 months since he had chosen his empire over the one person who had ever made him believe in love. Alexander walked slowly, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. He ignored the curious glances from shoppers who occasionally recognized him from magazine covers or financial news segments. Once he might have enjoyed the attention, relishing the aura of power and success that clung to him like a tailored suit. Tonight it all felt meaningless. His empire was intact, his fortune untouched, yet his life was emptier than the echoing marble halls of his residence. He reached for a bag of apples, his thoughts elsewhere, when his gaze drifted to the far end of the aisle. The sight struck him with the force of a freight train. A woman stood with one hand braced against her lower back, the other carefully selecting ripe tomatoes. Her dark hair cascaded down her shoulders in loose waves catching the bright grocery lights in a way that made it shimmer. He knew that hair. He knew the elegant tilt of her neck, the careful grace in her movements. For an instant time collapsed, and the air in his lungs froze solid. It was Lila Monroe. Alexander's grip tightened on the apple in his hand until the fruit bruised beneath his fingers. He had not allowed himself to imagine this moment. He had told himself she was gone, from his world forever, sealed off behind the closed door of their marriage. Yet here she was, tangible and breathtaking as ever. But something else, something far more earth-shattering, drew his attention away from her face. The unmistakable swell of her belly, rounded, undeniable, visible, even beneath the flowing blue maternity dress she wore. 7 months. Alexander's mind roared with calculations, each number striking like a hammer blow. 7 months since the divorce, 8 months since their last night together. His breath faltered. The baby she carried could not belong to anyone else. It was his. The world around him blurred. He no longer heard the chatter of shoppers, the faint music playing overhead, or the beeping registers in the distance. All he saw was her standing there with a protective hand over the life growing inside her. His child, their child. The truth slammed into him with merciless clarity. She had never gone through with it. She had never had the abortion he had cowardly suggested in that terrible moment of fear and pride. Memories collided with the present. He saw again the night she had told him about the pregnancy, her eyes bright with hope and trembling joy. He heard again the words he had spoken, cold and devastating, choosing financial security and corporate reputation over her happiness. He remembered the silence that had followed the light dying from her eyes and the divorce papers that arrived weeks later. He had signed them without protest, too consumed by shame and the crushing weight of his empire to fight for her. And now, 7 months later, here she was, carrying his child. Lila shifted slightly, turning to place the tomatoes in her cart. At that exact moment, her gaze lifted and collided with his across the aisle. Her face went pale, and in an instant her hand moved instinctively to shield her stomach, as though protecting the baby from him. The gesture cut deeper than any words could have. Even now, even carrying his child, she still felt the need to guard herself and the life inside her from Alexander Pierce. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Their eyes locked hers, filled with fear and caution, his with shock and desperate longing. Then just as quickly, she broke the connection. Her movements became hurried, clumsy in her urgency to flee. She abandoned the cart she had carefully filled and walked briskly toward the exit, her dark hair swaying behind her. Alexander's body reacted before his mind caught up. He dropped the bruised apple back onto the pile and pushed his cart aside, his long strides carrying him after her. His pulse thundered in his ears as he passed startled shoppers, ignoring the murmurs of recognition that trailed in his wake. He had to reach her. He had to speak to her. He had to understand. By the time he burst into the cool Manhattan night, she was already climbing into a weathered Toyota Corolla parked near the entrance. The car coughed as it started a sound far too frail for the task of carrying her and his unborn child. Alexander froze, watching helplessly as the taillights glowed red and disappeared into the stream of evening traffic. The billionaire who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, who had stood unflinching before hostile boards and ruthless competitors, now stood powerless in a grocery store parking lot. He had faced down some of the sharpest minds in global finance, yet a single glance from the woman he had once called his wife had unraveled him completely. The cold air bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. Inside him, the realization settled heavy and immovable. For 7 months, he had told himself he had lost everything that mattered because of one mistake. Now he knew the mistake was even greater. He had not just lost her, he had abandoned her to carry their child alone. He returned to his penthouse that night, the city skyline glittering outside his window like a cruel reminder of all he had achieved and all he had sacrificed. He sat in the silence, staring at his reflection in the glass, haunted by the image of her pale face and the protective way she held her stomach. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, her fear, her mistrust, the life inside her that he had once rejected. The man who owned skyscrapers and global assets could not escape a single truth. Lila Monroe was 7 months pregnant, and Alexander Pierce had just discovered he was going to be a father. A year earlier, Alexander Pierce had stood at the top of the world. His tech finance conglomerate was expanding aggressively. Investors were lining up to pour in more capital, and the financial press hailed him as the golden visionary of his generation. Yet beneath the polished veneer of control cracks had already begun to form. The board of directors had grown restless, whispering about his unorthodox strategies and his refusal to tie himself to political alliances that could protect the company. The pressure was relentless, a daily war of numbers meetings and silent threats. It was during those turbulent months that Lila Monroe, his wife of 3 years, walked into his office, late one evening carrying a secret that should have been a blessing. She wore her nurse's scrubs, her dark eyes shining with excitement, though her hands trembled slightly as she held something behind her back. "Alex," she said softly, and there was a note in her voice that pulled him away from the financial reports spread across his desk. He looked up weary from another battle with the board and saw her smile as she revealed the small white stick with 2 undeniable pink lines. For a moment, time stopped. A baby. Their baby. Alexander's chest tightened with a rush of emotions. he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Joy, awe, disbelief. He stood quickly, taking the test from her hands, staring at it as though the lines themselves could change his destiny. "We are having a baby," Lila whispered, her voice trembling between laughter and tears. She reached for his hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. "Alex, this is real. We are going to be a family." His heart thundered with the weight of that word, family. For a fleeting second, he imagined holding a tiny child. Imagined Lila glowing with motherhood, imagined laughter filling the empty rooms of their penthouse. But as swiftly as the dream appeared, it collided with the cold, merciless reality stacked on his desk. Unpaid loans, angry shareholders. The threat of losing everything he had built since his 20s. He pulled his hand back, the warmth of her touch replaced with icy fear. "Lila," he began, carefully forcing his voice to remain steady. "We are not ready for this. My company is under siege. The board is waiting for any excuse to call me reckless. A baby right now could ruin everything." Her smile faltered, confusion clouding her expression. "Ruin everything, Alex? This is our child. How could that ruin anything?" He paced the length of his office, his mind torn between love and terror. "We cannot afford a scandal. If they find out you are pregnant while we are restructuring, they will call me distracted, unstable. Investors will pull back. This could cost thousands of jobs." Lila stared at him in stunned silence before she finally spoke, her voice sharp with hurt. "Are you seriously telling me that the child we created is a scandal to you?" He ran a hand through his hair, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm saying maybe we should consider other options. We can wait until things are stable. We can try again later." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lila's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, her eyes filling with tears. "Other options," she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You mean an abortion?" The word echoed in the air like a curse. Alexander closed his eyes, hating himself, even as he nodded slightly. "I am just asking you to think about it. For us, for the future." The light in her gaze shattered. The hope she had carried into the room crumbled into despair. She stepped back from him as though he had struck her. "I could never," she said, her voice breaking. "I grew up in an orphanage, Alex. Do you understand what that means? My mother left me at the hospital before I was a week old. I grew up with no family, no one to tuck me in at night, no one to fight for me. Do you know what I promised myself when I turned 18 and left that place? I swore I would never abandon a child the way I was abandoned. I swore I would give my child the love I never had. And now the man I thought was my partner, the man I trusted with my heart, is asking me to kill the one life I was meant to protect." She turned away from him, tears streaming down her cheeks, her shoulders trembling with the force of her grief. He reached out, desperate to stop her, but his hand fell uselessly at his side. Words tangled in his throat, excuses and justifications that sounded hollow even to him. She left his office that night without another word. For 3 days she did not speak to him. When she finally did, it was only to ask one question. They were in the kitchen, bills scattered across the table, silence heavy between them. She looked at him with eyes that no longer held trust, but only raw truth. "Do you want this baby, Alex? Not can we afford it. Not will the company survive it. Do you want our child?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The fear, the pressure, the relentless storm. inside him overwhelmed the love he could not voice. "I do not know," he admitted at last. That single answer was enough. 2 weeks later, Lila packed her things and moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn. A week after that, divorce papers arrived at his office. She had written irreconcilable differences, but Alexander knew the truth. He had failed her. He had failed their child. He had failed himself. The day he signed those papers, he felt a hollow ache settle into his chest. A wound he told himself was punishment for his weakness. He buried himself in work, telling himself it was for the best, that she deserved someone stronger, someone braver. He told himself she would be better off without him. He told himself 100 lies just to survive the emptiness. But none of those lies could erase the memory of her voice trembling with hope, her hands pressing protectively over the life inside her, or the look in her eyes when he chose fear over love. And now, standing in a Manhattan grocery store 7 months later, he realized with soul-deep agony that she had kept her promise. Lila Monroe had chosen the child over him. She had chosen love over his fear. The night after seeing Lila at Whole Foods, Alexander could not sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as the image of her pale face replayed over and over. He had expected time to dull the wound of their divorce, but seeing her with his child had ripped it wide open again. Every instinct told him not to let her slip away this time, not to make the same mistake twice. By morning, exhaustion gave way to determination. He had built a fortune by tracking down opportunities and refusing to give up once he had identified what mattered. Now, more than any contract or company, she and their child mattered. He needed to know how she was living, needed to see with his own eyes that she and the baby were safe. That afternoon, he instructed his driver to follow her Corolla discreetly after she left the grocery store. He told himself it was not obsession, but responsibility, though he knew deep down it was both. The car led them across the bridge into Brooklyn, where the glitter of Manhattan skyscrapers gave way to aging apartment buildings and narrow streets lined with small shops. Alexander had not been to this part of the city in years. His world was one of penthouses, boardrooms, and luxury hotels. Watching Lila turn into a modest complex with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Maple Court Apartments, something inside him twisted. She parked slowly, the engine rattling as if each mile was a battle. Carrying 2 paper bags of groceries against her belly, she climbed the cracked stairs to the 2nd floor. Alexander memorized the number 2B and felt shame wash over him. The woman he had once sworn to protect was raising their child in a place far beneath the life he could have provided. That night he stood by the window of his penthouse staring out at the glittering skyline. Yet the city lights no longer filled him with pride. Instead, they mocked him, reminding him of all he had chosen over her. He poured a glass of scotch, but the burn did not ease the hollow ache. He could still see the way her hand had flown protectively to her stomach in the grocery store, the unspoken message that she no longer trusted him even to be near their child. The next evening, he gathered his courage and went to Brooklyn. He wore no suit, no armor of wealth, just a simple jacket and jeans. His black town car looked out of place, parked on the narrow street, but he did not care. He climbed the stairs to 2B and knocked softly. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing with dread and hope. The door opened after a moment, and there she was, Lila Monroe, her hair pulled back, wearing a loose sweater stretched over her rounded belly. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, then hardened instantly into steel. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp. He swallowed. "I needed to see you, to talk. Lila, I saw you yesterday, at Whole Foods." "You should not be here," she cut in coldly, stepping into the doorway as if to block his view of the apartment behind her. "You lost the right to be part of my life when you told me to end this pregnancy. You do not get to show up 7 months later as if nothing happened." Her words pierced him, but he did not flinch. He deserved every dagger of blame. "I know what I said. I know what I did. And I regret it every day. But Lila, that is my child. Our child. Please let me at least be what," she snapped. "A father. You chose your company over this baby before she even had a heartbeat. Do you think you can walk back in now and play the hero?" "You are too late, Alex." The sound of his name on her lips filled with bitterness instead of love nearly broke him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I was afraid of losing everything I had worked for, afraid of failing. I thought I was protecting us, but I see now I was only protecting myself. Lila, I am not here to erase the past. I just want a chance to make it right." Her eyes flickered with pain before she forced the mask of anger back into place. "You cannot make it right. I carried this baby alone for 7 months. I went to every appointment alone. I felt her kick for the first time alone. You made me do this without you, Alex. You do not get to rewrite history just because you finally feel guilty." He opened his mouth to respond, but she shook her head sharply and stepped back. "Go home. Go back to your skyscraper and your shareholders. Leave me out of it." With that, she closed the door firmly in his face. Alexander stood there in the dimly lit hallway, the peeling paint and faint smell of dampness pressing in around him. For the first time in years, he felt small, powerless, unwelcome. Slowly he turned and walked back down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. That night in his penthouse, the silence was unbearable. He had thought seeing her again would bring relief, some sense of direction. Instead, it only deepened the chasm between them. He poured himself another drink, but pushed it away untouched. He could not drown this pain with alcohol or distractions. The truth was too clear. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now she wanted nothing to do with him. Yet beneath the despair, a spark of determination refused to die. He had built his empire by enduring setbacks and fighting harder each time he was told no. This was no different, except it was everything. He could not give up, not when his child's future and the love of his life were at stake. Still, he knew words alone would never sway her. Promises were meaningless after what he had done. If there was any hope left, it would be in what he did, not what he said. He looked around his penthouse, at the polished steel and glass, at the expensive art on the walls, and for the first time it all felt worthless. None of it mattered if he could not win back her trust. Lila was right. He had chosen the company over their family once. If he wanted even the smallest chance to be in their lives again, he would have to show her that choice would never be repeated. He set down the untouched glass and whispered to the empty room, "I will prove it to you, Lila. I will prove I can be the man you and our baby deserve." The words echoed in the silence, and for the first time in months, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. That night, the city seemed quieter than usual, though Alexander knew it was only his mind amplifying the silence. He sat in the darkened penthouse, the lights of Manhattan, glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a reminder of everything he had gained and everything he had lost. The glass reflected his image back at him. Sharp suit jacket, thrown across a chair tie, loosened face pale and weary. He looked at himself and saw not the billionaire the magazines adored, not the visionary the markets admired, but a man hollowed out by his own choices. His thoughts circled endlessly back to the moment in the grocery store. Lila's eyes going wide with fear, her hand flying instinctively to her stomach, as if to shield their baby from him. That gesture haunted him, playing on repeat in his mind. It told him more than words ever could. She no longer saw him as a partner, as a protector, or as someone who could be trusted with their child. He had become the threat she braced against. The knowledge pierced him deeper than any boardroom defeat ever had. He poured a glass of water, though his hand trembled as he lifted it. The water tasted of nothing, but he drank anyway, trying to calm the storm in his chest. He remembered that night a year ago with excruciating clarity. Lila standing in their kitchen, holding the pregnancy test, eyes glowing with joy. His response had been cowardice, wrapped in practicality, fear dressed as logic. He told himself it was about timing, about the company, about stability. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He had been afraid to lose control, afraid to risk imperfection in the carefully constructed empire he had built. And in that fear he had chosen to sacrifice the one person who had ever loved him without conditions. He had always believed strength meant dominance, precision, and power. But now he saw that true strength would have been to hold her close, to whisper reassurance. When the world felt uncertain, to choose love over fear. He pressed his palms to his eyes, but that did not erase the image of her walking away from him. Tonight, voice sharp and cold. "Go home. Leave me out of it." The words reverberated through him, each syllable proof of how deeply he had wounded her. He had faced countless enemies across negotiating tables, men and women who wielded billions like weapons, yet none of them had ever left him this undone. None of them had ever reduced him to this aching shell of guilt. Alone in the penthouse, he tried to recall the man he had once been before ambition consumed him. He thought of his childhood, the son of a steelworker who taught him the value of persistence. He had once believed money was only a tool, not the purpose. But somewhere along the climb, he had started confusing success with worth power with love. And when Lila had given him the chance to build something real, something lasting, he had pushed it away with trembling hands. He walked through the vast apartment, each room echoing with emptiness. The expensive art felt lifeless. The sleek furniture felt cold. Even the view of the skyline, once his symbol of triumph, seemed now like a cage of glass and steel. He imagined Lila in her small Brooklyn apartment, a bassinet tucked into a corner, her hands smoothing blankets and folding baby clothes. She was preparing for a life without him, creating a home out of nothing while he sat in a palace too silent to be called a home. He leaned against the window, forehead pressed to the cool glass, and let the weight of guilt press down fully on his shoulders. He had been a coward. He had abandoned the woman he loved. He had abandoned his child. And now every instinct told him it might already be too late to fix it. Yet even as despair gnawed at him, another voice whispered in the back of his mind. It was not too late until the final door closed. He had built empires from ruins before. He had pulled victories from disasters by refusing to surrender. Could he not fight for this one thing that mattered more than all the contracts, more than all the skyscrapers, more than all the glowing headlines? His reflection in the glass stared back, eyes hollow, but burning faintly with determination. He whispered to himself, the words sounding fragile in the vast emptiness. I will not run again, not from her, not from our child. I will face whatever it takes. The city outside pulsed with indifferent life, but for Alexander, the night was a reckoning. He could not undo the words he had spoken or the fear he had caused, but perhaps he could atone. Perhaps guilt, heavy and suffocating, could become the fire that forged him into the man he should have been all along. The days that followed were a blur of restless energy for Alexander. He rose early, worked late, but no matter how many meetings filled his schedule or how many zeros danced across contracts, his thoughts remained chained to Brooklyn. He found himself driving past Maple Court Apartments more than once, telling himself it was only to reassure himself that she and the baby were safe. Yet each time he saw the faint glow of light from her second-floor window, the ache in his chest deepened. One morning he spotted her at the community clinic, where she worked part-time as a counselor. She stood outside beneath the faded awning, speaking gently to a young mother balancing a toddler on her hip. Alexander stayed in his car watching the way. Her patience and compassion seemed to steady those around her. He remembered when that gentleness had been his anchor, when she had stood by him during his darkest business failures, never once questioning his worth. He wanted to get out, to approach her to say something as simple as hello, but fear of rejection rooted him in place. Later that week, fate intervened again. He had stopped by a pharmacy near her neighborhood to buy bottled water when he saw her across the aisle, holding a prenatal vitamin bottle, comparing prices with furrowed brows. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Lila," he said softly. She froze, her shoulders stiffening before she turned. The wall in her eyes was immediate. "What are you doing here?" He forced a faint smile. "Same as you, just running errands." She slid the bottle into her basket and turned away. Desperate, he tried again. "Are you taking care of yourself? Is the baby?" She cut him off sharply. "Do not pretend you care now. You made your choice." The sting of her words lingered even after she walked out of the store, leaving him standing alone with his unanswered questions. Yet he could not stop himself from trying. Over the next 2 weeks, he encountered her in small, fleeting moments that seemed orchestrated by fate or perhaps by his persistence. Once he found her in Prospect Park, sitting on a bench with a book in hand, sunlight warming her profile as children played nearby. He approached cautiously, offering a paper bag with 2 coffees. "Decaf for you," he said, holding it out. She glanced at it, then at him, and for a moment he thought she might accept. Instead, she shook her head. "I do not want anything from you, Alex." Her voice softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Not even coffee." He carried the untouched cup back to his car, but the fact that she had not walked away immediately gave him a sliver of hope. Another evening he spotted her outside the apartment complex, struggling with bags of groceries. Instinct overrode hesitation. He crossed the street quickly. "Let me help you with those." She stiffened. "I can manage." He ignored the dismissal and gently took the heavier bag from her hand. "Just let me carry one, please." She hesitated before finally nodding. They walked in silence up the stairs, and when they reached her door, she opened it just wide enough for him to set the bag inside. He caught a glimpse of a bassinet in the corner of the living room. Tiny clothes folded neatly on the couch. The sight nearly undid him. She noticed his eyes lingering and said firmly, "This does not mean you are part of this. Thank you for the bag, that is all." Then the door closed again. Each encounter left him torn between despair and determination. He wanted to demand forgiveness, to beg for another chance, but he understood that words would never be enough. Lila had built her walls high and strong, not only to protect herself, but to protect the life inside her. If he wanted any chance at redemption, he would have to chip away at those walls with actions, not speeches. So he changed his approach. He stopped bringing gifts she could reject. He stopped asking questions that forced her to answer. Instead, he looked for quiet ways to prove he was present. He arranged with the building superintendent to pay for repairs in her complex, ensuring the heat worked properly and the leaking stairwell light was fixed. He anonymously covered the grocery bill once, when he saw her at the checkout line, short on cash, though she never knew it was him. More than once, he followed her car at a distance late at night, making sure she reached home safely before driving back to Manhattan. He told himself it was not surveillance, but protection, though deep down he knew it was both. Yet even in these small gestures, he began to understand the truth. He could not buy back her trust with convenience or money. What mattered was consistency, the proof that he was willing to show up again and again, even when she turned him away. One Sunday afternoon, he saw her at the park again, watching a group of children chase each other across the grass. He did not approach, only stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, allowing himself to imagine a future where he might stand beside her. For a fleeting moment, her gaze swept over him. Their eyes met. This time she did not flinch, though she quickly looked away. That tiny pause was enough to keep him going. That night, lying awake in the cavernous silence of his penthouse, Alexander whispered to himself the vow he had been forming with each small encounter. He would not force his way back into her life. He would not demand forgiveness. He would show her one quiet act at a time that he was no longer the man who had walked away. He would prove to her that he could be trusted with what mattered most. He knew it would take time, perhaps more than he deserved. But he also knew this was the only way forward. For the first time in months, the emptiness inside him felt less like a void and more like a space waiting to be filled. The storm rolled in just after dusk, heavy clouds spilling over Brooklyn like a bruised blanket. Rain lashed the streets in furious sheets, turning sidewalks into rivers and blurring the glow of street lamps. Alexander had been restless all day, pacing his penthouse, unable to focus on the endless reports waiting on his desk. Something gnawed at him, a premonition he could not shake, and against reason he found himself driving back toward Maple Court Apartments. His black sedan cut through the storm wipers, thrashing furiously, until he spotted the familiar Toyota Corolla pulled over at the side of a narrow street, just blocks from Lila's apartment. Steam curled from beneath the hood, mixing with the downpour, and there she was struggling with the door, clutching her belly with one hand, while peering helplessly into the engine. Alexander's heart lurched. He parked a few feet away and stepped into the torrent umbrella, snapping open above him. "Lila!" He called, his voice nearly drowned by the rain. She froze, then turned her face pale in the dim glow of the street lamp. Her sweater clung to her, soaked through at the shoulders, her hair plastered against her cheeks. For a moment he saw not the fierce woman who had pushed him away again and again, but someone exhausted, vulnerable, standing in the storm alone. "It is fine," she said quickly, defensive as always, though her voice trembled. "I will call someone." He approached slowly, keeping the umbrella angled to shield her as much as himself. "Let me look, please." She stepped back a fraction, but did not stop him as he lifted the hood. The acrid scent of burned coolant hit him instantly. The radiator hose had burst, spraying fluid that now hissed against the hot engine block. It was a simple enough problem for a mechanic, but impossible to fix here in the rain. He lowered the hood with a grim shake of his head. "It will need a tow. You cannot drive it like this." She pressed a hand to her temple, eyes closing briefly. He could see her calculating the cost of repairs, the hassle of arranging a tow, the thought of carrying her groceries up 2 flights of stairs alone in the storm. Her cart sat in the back seat, bags already soaked through at the seams. "I can manage," she muttered, though her shoulders sagged. Alexander held out his hand. "Let me carry these upstairs for you, at least that much." She opened her mouth to protest, then looked at the downpour of the heavy bags at her swollen belly. Pride warred with practicality on her face, until finally, with a weary sigh, she nodded. "Just the groceries." "Then you leave." He nodded in return, a silent agreement before lifting the bags easily in his arms. They walked side by side across the slick pavement, the umbrella shielding them imperfectly as rain streamed down around them. Lila moved carefully, one hand braced against her lower back, the other gripping the railing of the stairwell as they climbed. Alexander slowed his steps to match hers, his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from the simple intimacy of walking beside her again. At her door, she unlocked it quickly and pushed it open just wide enough for him to step inside with the groceries. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and baby powder. The living room was small but tidy, a worn sofa pushed against the wall, bright yellow throw pillows adding a touch of cheer. And in the corner, illuminated softly by the lamplight, sat a white bassinet draped in a delicate quilt. The sight nearly took his breath away. It was real. Their child's place in the world had already been prepared, even without him. He set the bags down quietly, unable to tear his eyes from the bassinet. Lila followed his gaze, her arms folding protectively over her belly. "Do not look at it like you are part of this," she said, her voice tight. "You are not. I did this alone. I am still doing this alone." Alexander turned to her, rain dripping from his hair, his chest tight with words he could barely form. "You should not have had to. I should have been here. I see that now." Her eyes flashed with anger and pain. "But you were not. You cannot erase 7 months of absence by showing up in the rain with a few grocery bags. That is not how this works." He flinched her words, striking deeper than any boardroom insult ever had. Yet he did not argue. He only nodded, swallowing hard. "You are right. It is not enough. But I want to do more, if you will let me." She shook her head, tears threatening behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Wanting does not change the past. You made your choice, Alex. You chose the company. You chose fear. I will not let you choose again when it comes to this baby. Silence filled the room, broken only by the rain pounding against the windows. Alexander glanced once more at the bassinet, then back at her. I understand. I will leave. He stepped toward the door, every part of him screaming to stay. To plead, to beg, but knowing that would only push her further away. With his hand on the knob, he paused. Thank you for letting me help tonight. Even if it was just groceries. She said nothing, only stood with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes guarded. He stepped into the storm again, the umbrella useless against the deluge, but the image of the bassinet burned into his mind. For the first time he truly grasped the enormity of what he had almost lost, of what he still might never regain. He had been given a glimpse into her world, and it was enough to ignite a fire he could no longer ignore. As he walked back to his car, soaked to the bone, he whispered into the storm, I will not abandon you again. Not you, not her, not our child. The words vanished into the rain, but in his chest they burned like a vow. The storm had passed by morning, but its weight lingered in Alexander's chest. He had seen the bassinet, the folded blankets, the way Lila's hands instinctively shielded the baby when he came too close. That image followed him into every meeting, every phone call, every moment of silence. He knew words were useless now. He had tried apologies and promises, and she had cut them down with the truth he could not deny. If he wanted to prove himself, it would have to be in ways she could not dismiss, ways that spoke louder than all the excuses he had carried. So he began with the smallest gesture he could think of. He showed up outside the clinic on a Tuesday morning, keeping his distance, waiting until she emerged with a file of paperwork tucked under her arm. When she spotted him, suspicion darkened her eyes immediately. What are you doing here? She asked, voice edged with weariness. He raised his hand slightly. I am not here to interfere. I am just here to walk you home. Nothing more. She almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. You think walking me 3 blocks will erase the past? He shook his head. No, but it will make sure you do not have to carry that bag alone. She glared at him, but said nothing as he took the heavy folder from her arms and walked beside her in silence. When they reached her apartment door, he handed it back without a word and left before she could tell him to go. The next week, he quietly arranged with the clinic director to volunteer funds for new equipment, requesting anonymity but ensuring Lila's department would benefit. He told no one, not even her, though he hoped someday she would notice. On another morning, he spotted her struggling with the subway stairs, one hand braced on her belly, the other clutching a grocery bag. He appeared at her side and took the bag without asking. She gave him a sharp look, but did not fight him. You cannot keep showing up like this, she said as they reached the top of the stairs. I do not want your help. He adjusted the bag in his arms. I know, but I will keep offering anyway. She shook her head, but when they reached her apartment, she let him set the groceries inside without slamming the door. That tiny shift, that absence of finality, was enough to keep him going. Soon he began attending prenatal classes, not officially, not as her partner, but sitting in the back of the room, quietly absorbing everything he could. At first she ignored him, but when she caught him taking notes with meticulous care, her expression softened almost imperceptibly. He learned how to measure breathing rhythms, how to support her during contractions, how to recognize signs of distress. Each fact he memorized felt like a brick in the foundation he was rebuilding. One afternoon, the instructor asked the partners to place their hands on their baby's position and listen with a stethoscope. Lila hesitated when the woman turned to her, pointing out that she had come alone. Before she could decline, Alexander stepped forward. "If you will allow me," he said quietly. Her lips parted in protest, but under the expectant gaze of the room, she finally nodded. He knelt beside her chair, his hand trembling as he placed it gently against the curve of her belly. The faintest kick pulsed against his palm, and his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, everything else vanished, the boardrooms, the scandals, the fears, and there was only the undeniable proof of life beneath his hand. His child. Their child. He blinked hard to steady himself, and when he dared to look up, Lila was watching him with eyes that flickered with something softer than anger. She looked away quickly, but he had seen it. After class, he did not push, only walked with her to the curb, keeping his distance. "Thank you for letting me," he said simply, before stepping aside to let her call a cab. Another evening, he returned from a late meeting to find himself driving past her building again. The lights were on, and through the window he glimpsed her pacing slowly, one hand rubbing her back. He almost kept going, but instinct turned the car around. He knocked softly, and when she opened the door, she looked startled, almost relieved, though she masked it quickly. "What is it?" she asked. "I saw you pacing," he admitted. "Do you need anything? Heat packs food. I can go." For the first time, she did not immediately send him away. Instead, she sighed and stepped back slightly. "There is soup on the stove. If you really want to help, stir it while I sit down." He moved into the small kitchen, stirring the pot carefully, the smell of vegetables and herbs filling the room. She lowered herself onto the couch, closing her eyes briefly. The moment was so ordinary it nearly undid him. He ladled soup into a bowl, set it gently before her, and stepped back without a word. She ate in silence, and though she never thanked him, she also did not tell him to leave until she was finished. Night by night, gesture by gesture, he wove himself back into the edges of her life. He changed light bulbs in the stairwell. He carried bags up the stairs. He waited quietly during her appointments and listened when she snapped at him instead of snapping back. He absorbed her anger as if it were his due, because it was. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls she had built began to shift. It was not forgiveness, yet not even trust, but it was something. And for Alexander, that sliver of progress was enough to keep fighting. He had once measured success in millions gained and empires expanded. Now he measured it in the way she allowed him to sit near her without bristling, in the way her eyes sometimes softened before hardening again, in the way she no longer looked at him as if he were only a stranger. These were the small victories he clung to, proof that redemption was not a single grand gesture, but 1,000 quiet ones. And though he knew the hardest battles were still ahead, he also knew this was the only path that mattered. The fragile rhythm Alexander had begun to build with Lila shattered one crisp autumn morning, when the headlines hit every major financial news outlet. He had woken early, hopeful after another evening spent quietly cooking soup in her tiny kitchen. But the optimism drained from his veins the moment he saw the banner stretched across the business pages. CEO Alexander Pierce abandons pregnant ex-wife. The article sprawled across 3 columns filled with photos, snapped at inopportune angles, him outside her building, him trailing behind her on the street, him sitting at the back of the prenatal class. What he had meant as quiet gestures of support had been twisted into damning evidence of hypocrisy. The world was told he had abandoned her and was now trying to claw back his reputation. Within hours, the company's stock began to tumble. Social media ignited with accusations of misogyny, cruelty, selfishness. Commentators debated not his financial strategies, but his moral compass. By midday, the board demanded an emergency meeting. Alexander sat in the gleaming glass conference room, the skyline spread wide behind him as 12 hardened directors stared him down. The chairman's voice was icy. "The scandal is costing us millions. Investors are nervous. Your personal failures have become a liability to this company." Alexander clenched his fists beneath the table. "This is my family. It is not a business transaction." But the board was unmoved. "If you want to stabilize the narrative, you will need to take decisive action," another director said. "Vanessa Caldwell has agreed to proceed with the engagement. Announce it and the press will shift. Her father's backing will secure investor confidence." Alexander felt the ground tilt beneath him. The engagement, the one political alliance he had refused a year ago, the one he had been pressured into considering as the company faced turmoil. Vanessa Caldwell, daughter of a powerful shareholder, had always been more deal than partner. He remembered her sharp smile, her thinly veiled disdain for Lila, and the way she had spoken of mergers and acquisitions, as if marriage itself were another corporate contract. The idea of tying himself to her, now while Lila carried his child, was unthinkable. Yet the board pressed harder, their voices a chorus of threat. "If you do not make this announcement, Pierce Global will collapse. We cannot afford further instability. Choose your company or your personal life, but understand that the former employs tens of thousands." That night, when Alexander returned to Brooklyn, the tabloids had already found her. Lila stood outside her building, clutching grocery bags, as a swarm of photographers shouted cruel questions. "Is it true he left you for another woman? How does it feel to be discarded while pregnant? Do you regret not aborting when he told you to?" Her face was pale, lips pressed tight as she pushed through the crowd. Alexander leapt from his car and forced his way between her and the cameras, his voice low and furious. "Back off, now!" The photographers jeered but scattered under the force of his glare. Lila turned on him, eyes blazing. "Is this what you wanted? Public humiliation headlines mocking me and our baby?" He shook his head desperately. "I did not leak it. I swear to you, they are twisting everything." Her laugh was brittle. "Of course they are. Because that is what happens when you chase power, Alex. The company was always more important than us, and now you have dragged me into your mess." She tried to push past him, but he caught her arm gently, careful of her balance. "I am not marrying Vanessa. I do not care what the board says. I will not choose them over you again." She froze, searching his face for lies. "You expect me to believe that? After everything he swallowed hard, I expect nothing. I am just telling you the truth." The next day he made good on his word. At a press conference arranged by the board, Alexander stood at the podium in front of a wall of cameras. The expectation was clear. He was supposed to announce his engagement to Vanessa Caldwell and stabilize the company's image. Vanessa herself stood in the wings, smiling coldly, waiting to step forward. The board members lined the back, their expressions severe. Alexander gripped the edges of the podium, the weight of his decision pressing like stone. The words prepared for him sat on the teleprompter, but he ignored them. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras. The press has written many things about me this week. He began, his voice steady, but laced with steel. Some of it true, some of it twisted, but there is one truth that matters above all else. 7 months ago, I made the greatest mistake of my life. I chose fear over love, pride over family. I abandoned the woman who gave me everything. That woman is Lila Monroe, and she is carrying my child. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Behind him, the board shifted uneasily. Vanessa's smile faltered into outrage. Alexander pressed on. I am not here to announce a political engagement. I am here to announce that the only commitment I will make is to my family. If this company cannot survive my honesty, then it does not deserve to survive. I will not trade my child's future for stock prices. I will not betray the mother of my child again. Flashbulbs exploded. Questions were shouted. Chaos erupted. But Alexander stepped away from the podium, ignoring the furious board, ignoring Vanessa's hissed threats. He walked out into the street, the noise of the city swelling around him, knowing he had just risked everything. That evening, news of his declaration dominated every outlet. Some called it reckless, others called it brave. Investors panicked, stocks dipped further, but ordinary people flooded social media with unexpected support. Hashtags praising his stand for family trended nationwide. For once, Alexander Pierce was not just a billionaire, but a man who had chosen love over power. And though the corporate world seethed, the public began to rally behind him. Yet none of that mattered when he returned to Brooklyn. What mattered was the look on Lila's face as she opened the door. Her eyes were wide, conflicted, filled with emotions she had buried deep. "You really said that?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I did, because it is the truth. You and our baby are the only future that matters." She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, her voice breaking. "You have no idea how much damage you have already done. But for the first time, I believe you mean it. For Alexander, that fragile sliver of belief was more valuable than all the empires he had ever built." The fallout from Alexander's public declaration was immediate and brutal. The board seethed, shareholders panicked, and gossip columns doubled their frenzy. For days, the financial press dissected every word he had spoken, while tabloids printed unflattering photos of Lila under headlines that screamed about betrayal scandal and a billionaire's illegitimate child. Lila tried to ignore it, but the whispers followed her through grocery aisles, in the waiting room of the clinic, even in the stairwell of her apartment building. The world had invaded her life because Alexander had finally chosen to fight for her, yet she was the one enduring the sting of judgment. She told him to keep his distance while the storm passed, but Alexander ignored her warnings. He could not leave her alone in the middle of the chaos he had unleashed. Still, the next blow came not from the press, but from his own legal team. One morning, his attorney placed a folder on his desk, expression grim. "You need to consider custody, Alex. If the narrative is not controlled, you will be painted as irresponsible. Filing for custody shows you are committed to the child's welfare, not just chasing after a woman who walked away from you." Alexander's stomach twisted. "Are you suggesting I sue Lila for custody?" The attorney adjusted his glasses. "I am suggesting you prepare the option. The company's survival depends on your image. Investors need reassurance you are in control. A custody filing proves you intend to be a father and not a liability." Rage flared in Alexander's chest. "This is not a press strategy. This is my child, my family. But the seed had been planted, and within days, rumors began to circulate. Articles speculated that Alexander Pierce intended to take full custody of the baby, portraying him as a powerful man reclaiming his legacy. When the story reached Lila, her fury was volcanic. She stormed into his office unannounced, her belly prominent beneath her coat, her eyes blazing with betrayal. "How dare you?" she hissed, slamming the newspaper down on his desk. The headline screamed, "Pierce prepares custody battle for heir." Is this what all of this was about? You stood in front of cameras and talked about family, and now you are plotting to take my child. Alexander rose quickly, hands raised. "No, Lila, listen to me. I never said that. I never authorized it. This is the board, the lawyers." She cut him off with a sharp laugh that bordered on a sob. "The board, the lawyers. You think that makes it better. You let them treat me and this baby like assets on a balance sheet. I trusted you for 1 second after that press conference, and this is what I get." He moved around the desk, desperate. "Please believe me. I do not want to take our child from you. I want us to raise her together." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You are lying. You have always chosen the company. Always. Now you want to use my baby to save your empire." She turned and left before he could stop her, the echo of the door slamming reverberating through his chest like a gunshot. For days she refused his calls, his messages, his attempts to explain. He showed up at her door, and she would not answer. He left letters in her mailbox that went unread. He felt the fragile trust he had begun to rebuild crumble again, and with it the crushing fear that he had lost her forever this time. Then came the night everything changed. It was past midnight when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar hospital number. He answered instantly, heart hammering. A nurse's voice filled his ear. "Mr. Pierce, this is St. Mary's Hospital. Your ex-wife, Lila Monroe, has been admitted with pregnancy complications. We need you to come immediately." The world tilted. He was in his car before he could think, rain streaking the windshield as the city blurred past. He burst into the hospital lobby, breathless, demanding her room. When he reached the maternity ward, he found her pale and trembling in a bed monitors strapped to her belly. The steady beep filled the air, but the doctor's tense faces told him this was no ordinary check. The lead obstetrician pulled him aside. "She is experiencing preeclampsia. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. The baby's heart rate is unstable. We recommend an emergency C-section, but we need a signature." Alexander's blood turned to ice. His gaze shifted to Lila. Her face etched with pain, her hands clenched around the sheet. She looked at him through half-closed eyes, anger still burning but eclipsed by fear. "Do not let them take her," she whispered weakly. His chest constricted. "No one is taking her," he said fiercely. He turned to the doctor. "Do whatever it takes to save them both. I will sign whatever you need." His signature scrawled across the consent form, his hand barely steady, but his voice unyielding. "Do it now." Minutes later, they wheeled her into surgery. Alexander was left outside, pacing the corridor drenched in dread. For the first time in his life, he faced something he could not negotiate, could not buy, could not control. The empire he had built meant nothing compared to the fragile life balanced on a scalpel's edge in the room beyond. He pressed his fists into his eyes, praying silently, bargaining with a universe he had never believed in until now. Save them. Please save them. Hours passed like centuries. He sank into a chair, head in his hands, replaying every cruel word he had ever spoken, every moment he had chosen fear over love. He would have given up every dollar, every building, every contract for the chance to take it back. Then at last the doors opened. A doctor stepped out, mask lowered, eyes weary but calm. Mother and child are stable. Both will need monitoring, but they are safe. Alexander's knees nearly buckled with relief. He whispered a thank you that came out broken, his voice raw. When they let him into the recovery room, he approached slowly. Lila lay pale but alive, her eyes fluttering open at his footsteps. He sank into the chair beside her, taking her hand gently. "You scared me," he whispered, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. She studied him quietly, too exhausted to fight, too drained to keep up her walls. For the first time in months, she let his hand remain in hers. He bent his head over their joined hands, tears hot against his lashes. "I chose wrong before, Lila, but tonight I chose you. I chose her, and I will keep choosing you both for the rest of my life, no matter the cost." She did not answer, but her grip tightened faintly around his fingers. That was enough. For the first time since their marriage crumbled, he felt hope flicker real and solid in his chest. The custody rumors, the scandal, the board, all of it faded before the simple truth. He had almost lost them, but he had not. And now he would fight with every breath to prove he deserved the second chance fate had given him. The days after the emergency surgery blurred into a haze of beeping monitors and hushed voices, but for Alexander, every moment felt carved into his soul. He refused to leave the hospital. He slept in an upright chair beside Lila's bed, his jacket draped over his shoulders, eyes snapping open at every sound. Nurses came and went, impressed by the billionaire's quiet devotion, though he paid no mind to their whispers. All that mattered was that Lila was breathing and their daughter was alive. When Lila stirred, he was there adjusting her pillow, coaxing her to sip water, reading aloud from the bland hospital brochures just to fill the silence. She tried at first to push him away, her words sharp despite her weakness. "You do not have to stay here." He met her gaze calm and unflinching. "I am not leaving." Day after day, he proved it. He learned the schedule of the nurses, kept track of her medications, asked questions of every doctor. He held their tiny daughter in the neonatal unit, his large hands trembling as he cupped her fragile form. The first time she cried, a thin, desperate sound, his chest cracked open. He whispered promises into her ear she could not yet understand. "I will always be here. I will never let you down, the way I let your mother down." When he returned to Lila's bedside, she watched him quietly, no longer able to deny the sincerity etched into his every action. One night, unable to sleep, she finally spoke into the dim glow of the room. "Why now, Alex? Why change only when it is almost too late?" He took a long breath, his voice low. "Because I finally saw the truth. The empire, the board, the headlines. None of it matters if I lose you. I thought fear was strength, but it was cowardice. Real strength is staying, even when it terrifies you. Real strength is choosing love." She looked away, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, but she did not tell him to leave. That was the beginning. When she was discharged, he insisted on driving her and the baby home. She tried to argue, but exhaustion won, and soon she was in the passenger seat, their daughter asleep in a car seat behind them. The sight of her in his rearview mirror filled him with awe. He carried the baby carrier up the cracked stairs, his tailored suit smudged with the grime of the stairwell, and set it gently inside the apartment. He did not try to claim space, only moved quietly, washing bottles, fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, replacing the broken lock on the door. When she protested, he answered softly, "I am not here to take over. I am here to help in any way you let me." Night after night, he returned, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with takeout she once loved, sometimes with nothing but his willingness to hold their daughter while Lila rested. He learned to rock the baby through midnight cries, pacing the small living room with patience he had never known he possessed. He burned through his shirts with spit-up stains, and instead of frustration, he wore them like medals of honor. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Lila began to let him in. One evening, as she sat feeding their daughter, she spoke softly. "You missed so much, Alex. The kicks, the cravings. The nights I lay awake, wondering if I could do it alone." His throat tightened. "I know, and I will never forgive myself for that. But I am here now, and I will not miss another moment if you let me stay." She studied him for a long time, then whispered, "This is not forgiveness. This is co-parenting." He nodded quickly. "I will take whatever you give me." Weeks passed, and the rhythm of shared responsibility began to form. They took turns soothing the baby, shopping together in the same grocery store where fate had reunited them, even attending checkups as a pair. Though her heart still guarded itself, Lila could not deny the change in him. This was not the man who had once chosen shareholders over family. This was a man who showed up in silence, day after day, without asking for anything in return. The tabloids lost interest, moving on to other scandals, but Alexander stayed. He turned down board meetings to rock his daughter through fevers. He missed interviews to sit beside Lila when she looked too tired to stand. He endured shareholder outrage with a calm that startled even him. He had finally learned what mattered. One night, as the baby slept in the bassinet, he and Lila sat on the worn couch in exhausted silence. The lamplight softened her features, shadows playing across her face. At last she turned to him. "You have changed," she admitted softly. "I never thought you could." He met her gaze, his own steady. "I never thought I could either, but losing you showed me what I truly was, and holding her showed me who I want to be." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded faintly. For the first time since the fracture of their marriage, a fragile bridge stretched between them. It was not yet love reborn, not yet forgiveness fully given, but it was trust beginning to grow, again one small moment at a time. And for Alexander Pierce, that was everything. The night began quietly with the city humming beneath their apartment windows. But just before dawn, Lila doubled over with a sharp gasp that pulled Alexander instantly from sleep. He rushed to her side, where she clutched her belly eyes wide with pain, sweat glistening on her forehead. "It is happening," she whispered, breathless, her voice trembling between fear and determination. Alexander's heart thundered in his chest as he grabbed the hospital bag he had packed weeks ago, gently helping her through each contraction while calling ahead to Mercy General. The drive felt like a blur of red lights and honking horns, but all he could hear was the sound of her ragged breathing and the pounding of his own pulse. At the hospital, nurses swept her into a delivery room and began monitoring vitals. Alexander stayed glued to her side, refusing to be ushered out despite the bustle of medical staff. He held her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, feeling her nails dig into his skin, with each wave of pain, and never once pulling away. Hours stretched into a grueling rhythm of shouts, sweat, and exhaustion. Lila's face contorted with agony, yet she pressed on, with a strength that left Alexander in awe. He dabbed her forehead with cool cloths, fed her ice chips, and murmured steady words that surprised even himself with their tenderness. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You can do this. We can do this together." There was a moment when she nearly broke, tears spilling as she cried out that she could not go on. Alexander bent low, pressing his forehead to hers, voice fierce and unwavering. "You are not alone this time. I am here. I will never leave. Look at me, Lila. I am not the man who walked away. I am the man who is staying no matter what." She clung to him, then sobbing through the next contraction, but her grip told him she believed him. The hours dragged on, until finally the doctor announced she was fully dilated, and the room shifted into high alert. Nurses positioned her machines, beeped frantically, and Lila bore down with cries that echoed through the sterile walls. Alexander whispered in her ear, squeezing her hand, feeling tears stream down his own face as he watched her fight for every breath. Then suddenly a thin wail pierced the chaos, and the entire room seemed to stop. The baby was here. The doctor lifted a tiny wriggling form and announced with a smile, a girl healthy and strong. For a heartbeat, Alexander could not breathe, could not move, overwhelmed by the sight of the life they had created. When the doctor asked if he wanted to cut the cord, his hands trembled, but he nodded, taking the scissors and making the cut that symbolized the beginning of a new world. Lila collapsed back against the bed, exhausted, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes shone with a light Alexander had not seen in years. They placed the baby on her chest, and Lila's trembling hands cradled the tiny body, her sobs filling the room with raw relief and love. Alexander leaned in close, his heart cracking open as he touched their daughter's tiny hand. The baby's cry softened into quiet breaths, her small chest rising and falling against her mother. "She is perfect," Lila whispered, voice shaking with awe. Alexander could not stop the tears that blurred his vision as he nodded. "She is our miracle. She is everything." The baby's delicate fingers curled around his thumb, and in that moment he felt chains break inside him. The chains of fear, pride, and selfishness that had once destroyed everything. Now there was only devotion, only the unshakable vow to protect this fragile life, and the woman who had brought her into the world. Nurses moved about, checking vitals and cleaning instruments, but Alexander barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the glow of Lila and their daughter, cocooned together in a bond deeper than anything he had ever known. He brushed a hand gently over Lila's damp hair, whispering, "I am so proud of you. You are incredible." She turned her face toward him, weary but luminous, and for the first time there was no anger in her gaze, only the fragile possibility of forgiveness. He kissed her forehead, careful not to disturb the baby, and let out a shuddering breath that seemed to release years of regret. As the room quieted, their daughter let out a small sigh and settled against her mother, utterly content. Alexander placed a hand over both of them, feeling the steady rhythm of life pulsing beneath his palm. The past was scarred, the future uncertain, but in this moment he knew with absolute clarity that he had been given a second chance. And this time he would not waste it. The days that followed their daughter's birth unfolded like fragile glass. each moment delicate yet radiant with the weight of new beginnings. The hospital released them after 3 days, and Alexander insisted on carrying both the infant seat and the overnight bags his face, set with quiet determination. Lila wanted to argue, but exhaustion silenced her. He buckled their daughter carefully into the car, his large hands uncharacteristically gentle, and drove with painstaking caution through the busy Manhattan streets until they reached her modest apartment in Brooklyn. The place that had once seemed small and worn now carried an air of sanctuary as he set the car seat gently on the living room floor and stood back watching in reverent silence as Lila lifted their baby out. Their daughter yawned, a tiny fist stretching toward the ceiling, and for the first time Alexander felt the bone-deep reality of fatherhood settle in. He was not just a man trying to fix his mistakes. He was a father with responsibilities that eclipsed every boardroom battle he had ever fought. The first nights were brutal. The baby cried at all hours, demanding feedings, soothing, and endless patience. Lila tried to shoulder it alone, but Alexander refused to let her. He set alarms on his phone, waking up to pace the living room with the infant in his arms, humming tuneless melodies, whispering words of comfort, learning how to change diapers under the dim light of a bedside lamp. Lila, watching him in the shadows, saw the billionaire CEO stripped of arrogance and pretense, transformed into a man humbled by spit-up and sleepless nights. One morning, as dawn broke pale across the skyline, she found him slumped in the rocking chair, their daughter asleep against his chest, his chin tilted forward in exhaustion. For the first time since their divorce, something in her heart softened. Over the weeks, the rhythm of co-parenting emerged. Alexander brought groceries, paid bills quietly, without fanfare, and fixed small things in the apartment without being asked. When she told him not to overstep, he simply nodded and replied, "I am here to support, not to control." His consistency spoke louder than any declaration could. At doctor appointments, he asked careful questions, but deferred to Lila, reminding her with his actions that he trusted her judgment. The old Alexander had been domineering, fueled by pride and fear of losing control. This new Alexander was steady, patient, willing to serve rather than command. Lila began to let her guard down in small ways. She allowed him to hold the baby while she showered, to prepare meals when she was too tired to rock their daughter to sleep. While she sat close by, she reminded herself this was co-parenting, not reconciliation, but her heart betrayed her when she caught herself smiling at the sight of him lying on the floor, their daughter perched on his chest, both of them giggling at nothing at all. Late one evening, as the baby slept, she broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it, choosing the company over us?" He looked at her shadows, deepening the lines of his face, and said softly, "Every single day. But regret does not change the past. What I can change is now and tomorrow and every day after that." His words settled between them, not absolution but an offering. Over time, neighbors began to notice the billionaire appearing regularly in the modest building, carrying diapers and formula holding doors for mothers with strollers, chatting easily with kids playing outside. The tabloids, once vicious, moved on to other scandals, but Lila realized she no longer cared. What mattered was not the headlines, but the man sitting on her couch at 2 a.m., with spit up on his sleeve and love in his eyes. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she caught herself imagining a future where they were more than co-parents. The thought frightened her, but it also filled her with an unfamiliar sense of hope. She pushed it aside, telling herself it was too soon, but the seed had been planted. Alexander never pressed, never demanded forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, he let his actions speak. Each day he showed up. Each day he proved that the man who once walked away was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, braver, and infinitely more human. The second chance was not sealed with grand gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet rhythm of shared responsibility, of whispered reassurances during midnight feedings of the small miracle, of building trust again, one heartbeat at a time. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew they were no longer standing on the ruins of the past, but building the foundation of something new, something fragile yet resilient, something worthy of the daughter who had brought them back together. 3 months later, spring sunlight spilled across Brooklyn, warming the steps of the small stone church, where Alexander and Lila had first volunteered years ago, back when their love was young and unscarred. Now the doors stood open, flowers blooming along the aisle, and a modest gathering of friends, neighbors, and family filled the pews. This was no grand society wedding, no glittering ballroom with cameras flashing, but rather a simple ceremony that spoke of humility and rebirth. Lila stood at the entrance in a pale ivory dress that flowed softly around her, their daughter cradled in her arms, sleeping peacefully with a tiny lace bonnet framing her face. Alexander waited at the altar, his tailored suit immaculate, yet understated his eyes locked on Lila with a devotion so clear it silenced every whisper in the room. As she walked slowly down the aisle, carrying their daughter, the congregation rose. Alexander stepped forward to meet her, halfway reaching gently to hold the baby for the remainder of the walk, a symbolic gesture that told everyone present he would carry their burdens as well as their blessings from this moment on. At the altar they stood together, their daughter nestled between them, and the minister spoke of forgiveness, of courage, of the love that grows not from perfection, but from persistence and grace. When it came time for vows, Alexander's voice broke, but he did not falter. He looked into Lila's eyes and said, "I once let fear drive me to abandon the very thing that gave my life meaning. But standing here with you and with her, I vow never again to let fear dictate my choices. I will rise every morning, choosing love over pride, family over power, and you over everything else." Lila's eyes shimmered with tears as she answered softly, "I lost trust in you once Alex and I told myself I would never open that door again. But you proved with every sleepless night, every act of quiet service that people can change when they choose love over fear. Today I choose to trust again, not because the past is forgotten, but because our future deserves to be written differently." Their daughter stirred, then tiny fists waving, and the congregation chuckled softly at the perfect timing. The minister blessed the family and pronounced them husband and wife once more. Alexander bent to kiss Lila gently, his lips trembling with the weight of gratitude and redemption, while their daughter cooed softly between them. Outside the church, sunlight bathed the steps as guests gathered, tossing handfuls of flower petals in celebration. There was no grand spectacle, no news cameras waiting, only genuine smiles and quiet tears of joy from those who knew how hard one this second chance had been. Alexander lifted their daughter high into the air, her laughter ringing out like music, then handed her back to Lila as they walked hand in hand down the church steps. Later, at the small reception in the community center, where their story had first begun, Alexander leaned close to whisper in Lila's ear, "This is our true beginning. No empire, no scandal, just us." She smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "And her," she added, glancing at their daughter. "Always her," he agreed. As the evening light filtered through the windows, they danced slowly to the same song that had played at their first wedding, but this time with their daughter between them, her tiny head resting against Lila's heart. It was not a fairy tale ending, but something deeper, something real. A story of two broken people who chose to build again, brick by brick, vow by vow, day by day. And as Alexander looked into Lila's eyes, he knew he would never take this second chance for granted.